Today we're going to talk about the Hydra. Oh yeah, that one. I really enjoy the Hydra. It's a fun monster to talk about because there's already enough jumping off points for us that it's really easy to get into the meat of the creature and come up with our own ideas and interpretations therein. So we can immediately go back to the Herculean labors and look at the original Hydra that was essentially the child of a she-dragon that was in charge of bile and poison and things like that, and a storm giant whose head reached the clouds and he had thousands of snake fingers. Yeah, so that sort of gives you an idea of where it comes from. It's also sometimes related to Chimera, Cerberus, etc., from those same Greek legends. Now, this version of the Hydra that Hercules had to fight was... I don't want to downplay it too much, but think of it as a very large boa constrictor snake that just splits off at the head into sometimes 3, sometimes 9, sometimes 12 different heads. This Hydra is also your bog standard where you cut off one head, 2 more grow in its place. Whether or not there's a limit to that, we might get to here in a minute. But the Hercules was able to defeat the Hydra using the help of someone else, so every time Hercules would cut off a head, the other individual would come up and cauterize the wound, fire damage, to stop the regrowth until finally there was just one head left, and this was the immortal head. This is the head that can't be killed. So Hercules cut it off, buried it under a rock, called it a day. That's one way to solve the problem, but that is our story. That's our Hydra that we can then work off of. Now, this is another creature that has obviously been interpreted a bunch of different times, but not as widely as other things like gargoyles and dragons, because the Hydra generally follows that set game plan, where it's a serpent-like creature, oftentimes related to dragons, but not necessarily, that has multiple heads. Whether or not one head is intelligent or all of them are intelligent is another question that is also widely varying, but it usually has some sort of regrowth or regeneration property, and it usually has some sort of poison or venom property. That's really cool. We can do a lot with that, because then when you get to the question later of what can you harvest from it, it makes it a lot easier to figure out some of the fun things to have your heroes, your characters, your stories use from these creatures, which in real-life history, one of the biggest things that you can always look at is what societies, what cultures did with the creatures they killed, with the trees that they had available to them, etc. So looking at the resources that we can harvest from them, we'll get to that question, but it's always a good idea when you are interpreting something for a story just to take 15 seconds and think about, oh, well, what could you cut off of this creature and use later? But I digress. So, we have our standard set for what a Hydra is. Now we can start to talk about some wild variations, such as the Dark Souls Hydra that you can find that is essentially the same serpentine heads, but attached to a turtle body that has, like, jellyfish tendrils off the back. I mean, I guess. Then you have things like Dragon's Dogma that goes back more towards the artwork that you can see for the Herculean tasks. It's shockingly hard to say, or Herculean labors, in which it's more of a snake body that just separates at the end. Now, the Dragon's Dogma Hydra is also interesting because it's the only one that I could find in which it's common for the tail to be used as a weapon along with the heads. It can do sort of a tail whip, which makes sense, right? Especially if you have a snake-like body, and especially if it's more in the line of a boa constrictor, why would it not wrap up prey? I mean, unless you're talking about a Hydra that is Godzilla-sized, which also happens sometimes in fantasy and lore, which is fun. I love it when creatures like that can be interpreted in such a way, because then we get up to Shadow of the Colossus style monsters, and that is cool. I love when fantasy plays with scale. Now, it's a dangerous tool to use, though, because if you are writing stories with heroes the size of humans, and you're putting them up against creatures the size of islands, looking at you, God of War, you have to make sure that your power level is scaled appropriately, because it would not be super easy for anybody but Kratos to fight that Hydra. You can find other examples, like in D&D, in which you have things like a fire Hydra and an ice Hydra that have breath attacks of their respective element, and resistances accordingly. Now, I don't know what you would do with a fire-style Hydra that has the regrowth ability, because then you're sort of up a creek without a cauterization tool. You can find a lot more examples of like a poison breath attack or a miasma attack, Dragon's Dogma once again. But that gets to a bigger question. If you do have a Hydra that has that regeneration ability, how many heads can it grow? If you cut off 10 heads and then you end up with 20, and then you cut off 20 and end up with 40, does it ever end? Like, will the creature just starve itself out because it's having to maintain that much body mass? Or are you going to find an ancient Hydra sitting in a tomb somewhere that has 1,000 heads waiting for the next prey? Let's get down to harvesting. We already talked about poison briefly, so does it have poison sac? Does it have venomous glands? Does it have the fangs? Are its eyes valuable? Obviously, if it has scales, everybody likes to harvest a scale and use it as armor, weapons, shields, things of that nature. What would happen if you put a Hydra fang on the end of a sword? That would be a cool weapon. Maybe? Let's talk about the blood. When you have a creature that can regenerate, you have to ask the question of, if you harvest X part of the creature, do the properties carry over? For example, could you use its blood in potions, like in Dungeons & Dragons? Could you use its blood in meals? What happens if you pour the blood on an open wound, as opposed to the poison or venom? With all that, as we head towards the end of the video, we can finally get to the most important part of this question, and that is the Hydra's crab friend. Because if we go back to the original myth, we see that Karkanos, the crab, the one that ends up being the constellation for Cancer after the fight, is there to assist the Hydra in the combat, and I, in my research, wasn't able to find another example of a Hydra being paired with a giant crab buddy. And I don't know why that's not a thing, but it should be, because having a Hydra, this horrifying draconoid sea serpent creature of doom, compared with a giant crab buddy who's there to assist, sounds awesome. And that's the kind of interpretation that we get to do. So, hopefully this helped. Hopefully it sparked a little bit of thought in you. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.